Hi, I want to talk in this module about the rights approach to ethics. And basically what the rights approach to ethics is it's a form of ethics. It's somewhat deontological in that it grants some status, like once one, you basically have some rule that you have to respect rights, and that's basically it. But the basic idea, and I'll kind of just, I'm kind of giving a rough idea of kind of maybe where it shares a little bit of its non-consequentialist in that form. It affords like a certain rule or a certain level of protection for everybody. And the idea is that rights are things you assign to entities, and then you then must respect those, and you can never violate those. And basically it's kind of deontological in that way. It's like instead of setting up rules or actions that you're supposed to behave, you're giving rights to entities, and then you must respect those, and you must work to respect those. And it's basically a form that is used oftentimes in law and government, and the idea there is you afford rights to the people, and then like the Declaration of Rights, whereas those rights, while they can be interpreted differently, and there may be some reinterpretation, but those are fundamental things that the government can never overstep, that individuals can't overstep with other people. One has a right to certain things, and you must respect those. Now, the first question is who gets rights? And traditionally, we kind of, as far as from a societal perspective, we do grant some rights to animals, but mainly we focus on the rights of humans, and more specifically, people. And the reason is the idea there is that in order to get rights, you're basically giving those to entities that are capable of moral decision making. Now, the idea here is that most creatures on this planet, most animals, the millions of bugs that exist probably in your house that you don't know about, maybe not millions. Well, maybe. On a microscopic level, I guess. Anyway, but as far as those millions of animals go, most of them function out of a sense of nature. They don't do things because they aren't doing things because they are deciding to do them. They do them simply because that's their nature. Ants go gather food, take it back. They look for food, they find it. They don't have a lot of thoughts. There's really very little evidence to the fact that animals do much other than act out of nature. Even your dog, to a certain degree, most of their decision making is made out of a sense of what their nature is, of how they behave within their pack and how they behave. And so most of these are purely nature. But when you get to certain levels of thinking, when you get certain levels of ability to think and reason, you realize that some of the things that are part of your nature are not things that are good. And so you make decisions to say, I'm not going to engage in those. That becomes moral decision making. And so when you are able to do that, you get labeled a moral agent. And basically what we do is we say, if you are a moral agent, then out of a sense that you're able to make decisions, you are now mandated to protect the rights of others, but you also are afforded rights because you are a moral agent. If you're unable to have rational ideas and unable to think and unable to make moral decisions, then we don't really consider you in moral considerations because you have no agency. You have no ability to make decisions. And essentially what we do is usually the things we look for is their ability to reason. Is the fact that you can think. That's what gives us the ability to make moral decisions. It's not just we're acting on nature. We have the ability to reason and to think. Now, as far as it goes, typically what we do is we differentiate between like a human and a person. A human is basically a physiological description. 46 chromosomes, biped, 2 arms, blah, 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 stands upright, things like that. But a person is usually considered an entity, a human that is able to think and is self-conscious. And by self-conscious, we mean the ability to be aware of itself. If it looks in the mirror, you realize that is you. You are not just part of a group. You're not an ant who doesn't necessarily have an individual concept of itself. It's simply performing the task of the colony. And so what happens is with humans, that's a physiological description. Person is an entity that's able to think and to be self-conscious. Now, personhood is not limited to humans. Animals could have personhood. They could have personalities. They could have the ability to reason and have their own individuality. Some people say that's true of dogs. It's not nearly at the level of humans, but it is there. And so we don't want to limit the concept of person to humans, but typically we only afford the rights to humans because of their strong personhoods. But other creatures, you don't even have to be a living. I mean, I suppose even like God is sometimes considered like the persons of the Trinity in Christianity. That there's personhood, or we would say perhaps like if you met an alien who was rational and self-conscious, we would consider them to be persons, and we would afford them rights. But mainly, we also afford that to humans. Now, there's a few things that come up here. One of them is that. We tend to afford rights to humans even if they aren't rational and self-conscious. Suppose a human is born with a significant physiological defect, or maybe they have a car accident and they're rendered incapable of decision making. They're rendered incapable of not decision making, but incapable of brain function. Their brain is dead. Terry Schiavo cases of the world, or other cases that have been fairly big in the world, in which a person had a car accident, was rendered brain dead, and then there were big debates over whether or not you could end their lives through euthanasia because of the fact that they were no longer capable of thought. And the basic idea there is that we still do typically afford them out of a sense that they are part of our species, they share so much in similarity, and we don't always know for sure what exactly, how you would judge. I mean, do you just simply go, oh, well, they're no longer as smart as the rest of us, so they're no longer a person? No, insofar as they're a human, we afford them those rights, out of a sense of compassion, out of a sense of solidarity. Now, there are some philosophers like Peter Singer, who coined the term speciesism, and he says, why don't we afford these same rights to other creatures, even if we don't see them as equal? Because they can still feel pain. Now, Singer is a utilitarian, and he believes the only thing that matters is your ability to feel pleasure and pain. But what Singer says, look, it is really kind of like racism. I mean, back in the day, during slavery and other things, oftentimes the argument was made that slaves were inferior, that they were incapable of thought, they were incapable of reason, and so they were really just like animals. And it's the same thing we do with like pigs and cattle and other things, is we say, well, they're not humans, they can't think, they're not rational. It's okay to kill and eat them. It's okay to use them for this purpose. It's okay to misuse them. And today, even in that case, we do, out of a sense of compassion, out of the sense that they can feel pleasure and pain, we do set rules that afford them rights, that they can't just be harmed for no reason, but we don't always afford them rights in the sense that they have a right to life, and they have a right not to be eaten as meat, or they have a right not to be used as lab rats in experiments. I mean, millions of lab rats get used every year for experiments, and for really frivolous experiments. I have a friend who is a scientist, and he actually sells, like, he has a company now that sells little things to contain rats and other things in these little cages so that they can x-ray them and do other things, so they can perform experiments on them. And he sells these things that hold them in, and he says that that actually, I think he said only like half or a third of most research is repeatable, or is that it can be duplicated. And he said the reason is because it's basically bad science. He said, so you kill millions of rats a year, and hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of rats are killed in what is essentially bad science, stuff that hasn't even been devised in a way that actually was a good experiment. And so the question is why do we allow this? Why do we allow this treatment of animals? They can feel pain, but yet we allow it. And so Singer says that's speciesism. We see them as somehow inferior because they lack the ability to reason and to think. Now, with that said, I think Singer kind of has a point. Now, he goes a little bit extreme and doesn't think there should be any animal experimentation, disagrees with the consumption of meat, things like that. I think he's right in that we should be very careful with our treatment of animals. Out of a sense of humanity, we should treat them and afford them rights. But the idea that they should be afforded equal rights to humans is perhaps a little bit of a stretch. I mean, it's one thing to say, it's a little bit of a false analogy to suggest that, reason that, I'm sorry, not reason, but to suggest that, it's a little bit of a false analogy to suggest that, racism is the equivalent to speciesism, because there are real and marked abilities in rational and ability for language, ability to act beyond nature, the ability for moral agency in humans or persons versus other species. But Singer says that basically Singer has that issue. And so the question is, should animals have rights? Is kind of what I'm getting at. And the issue is they should have rights insofar as they feel pleasure and pain, and we should avoid that. But insofar as anything else, we typically don't afford them rights. The only other reason we afford them rights is really just out of a sense of property. And that is that I have a right to my property, and I have a right for you not to come over and tear up my property. And so you don't have a right to come and hurt my dog or hurt my cat or hurt my cattle or hurt my things, right? And so those, essentially, animals are granted rights on a level of property, but that's only contingent upon the humans, and out of a sense of compassion. And the compassion is born out of the sense that they can feel pleasure and pain, and so out of our humanity we should consider that, but they are never granted the same level of rights as a human. Humans and persons are granted rights because they're capable of decision making, and we should afford them that. Now, as an example of this animals getting rights idea, my kids and we were at my parents' recently for 4th of July, and just a few days ago was when I'm recording this. And we had there's a creek that goes through the back, and we went out there, and there were some fish, little itty bitty minnows, like really little ones, and we scooped some out and we put them in a bottle, and we're like, okay, we'll release them back, or actually we decided we were gonna let them grow up in a bowl and see how they grew, and then put them back into the creek. And so we were doing this, and Grandma didn't realize this bottle we'd put them in had. My mom didn't realize that this bottle we put them in had little fish in it. And so she sees it, and she's just cleaning up, and she dumps it into one of her plants and then throws the bottle away. So there go the fish. And my 7-year-old niece and my 5-year-old and 4-year-old are sitting at the table, and they're like, oh, it's no big deal. You can go get more at the store. They're just fish. And I said, they're still living creatures. They're still creatures that can feel pleasure and pain. They may not be very aware of it. Fish are not particularly bright. They're probably not highly self-conscious. I actually did go through this with my niece and kids because I'm a philosopher and I have those kind of conversations. But the case is that I said, we still need to have respect for them. We don't just kill creatures. We don't just go, oh, we can buy another one. It's not a paperclip. They're not things. They can feel pain, they can have pleasure, and so it's not purely a property issue. And so we do typically afford them some rights, but we don't afford them the same level of rights that others have. But when we do afford an entity rights, the idea is those are rights they have, and that we must respect them. We cannot trample upon those.